everyone, it's Kerry back with you today. Today I'm going to share with you some things that I find helpful when I'm trying to get an aged look for my fabrics. So some tips on distressing and also a few tips on how you can do some faux techniques to get that aged look on some fabrics. Ideally, it would be great if we could all source vintage fabrics or, rust things over time, but sometimes you need something more quickly and you just don't have time to wait a few weeks for pins to rust and that sort of thing. So today I'm going to show you how you can make these little faux rusted pin clusters, and you don't have to wait too long for these. And I'm also going to take you through some of the things that I do to fabrics to make them have that aged look and feel. So before we move on to the rusted pin technique, I just want to show you a couple of things that I do to fabrics that let me get an aged look and feel without having to, wait for them to age naturally. Now, I do have a couple of fabrics here to show you as a comparison. So this piece of fabric was left outside and it had lots of different things fall on it. It was on a table, it got sun bleached, it had bugs and all sorts of things crawling on it. It was absolutely filthy and feral when I brought it inside, but I have washed it. But it's got these wonderful naturally worn holes and sort of moth-eaten look about it. So once I dye this, it will look amazing, and all of this wear and tear is authentic and has happened over time. But if I want something that has this sort of worn and weathered and moth-eaten look, another way that you can achieve that is using some sandpaper. Now I've got this little sanding block that has been used for all sorts of things, paper and fabric and metal. So it's a little bit worn. So I've got a piece of fabric here that has had some rust staining by the looks of it. And I've got a little wooden block here. Now if you're working with a block, you can get some great techniques and straight lines by utilising the edges of the blocks when you're sanding, and you'll get a very specific sort of hole or wear mark. So hopefully you can see how that's kind of a straight line. If you want something that's less specific, you can rub along the surface of the wood, being mindful not to go on the edges, and you'll sort of wear away parts of the fabric against the wood. So you'll sort of get something a bit more organic like that. But I find if I want to distress the fabric and not end up with any specifically harsh lines, it's better to do it around something that's rounded. So I've just got my water sprayer here, and I can rub my sandpaper along here, and I'll get some sort of organic looking holes without them being in a specifically straight line. So using something round will give you a more random outcome, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So that's a great technique for distressing the fabric and having it look old and moth-eaten without having to wait for that to happen naturally. Now these fabrics here have been treated with bleach before I've then tea stained them. So this is cotton lace, and it was actually black, jet black, before I started. Now cotton will bleach, so I basically dumped the lace into 100% pure bleach that I had in a small container, and I left it there, I think it was about 3 days by the time I pulled it out. And not only did it take the colour out of the fabric and left me with this it was more of a peachy colour before I tea dyed it, but it's also sort of damaged the fibres in the lace so that I can actually tear them by hand. It's not so damaged that it's not sort of still structurally sound, like you can still use it to do bindings or anything like that. I wouldn't use it as a lace tie, because if you're pulling it tight it would run the risk of tearing, but gluing it down and using it for small things, it's absolutely perfect, and you get this lovely natural sort of worn look on the end of it. Some of the pieces I can actually go in and pull apart sideways where they've been exposed to more bleach over a longer period of time, but even on the pieces like this one's not tearing sideways, but I can go in with a pair of scissors and just sort of poke a few extra large holes in the lace and then that gives me like a really sort of worn, organic feel to the lace and makes it look more antique or vintage. So yeah, I really like that technique. Now this fabric here has been rusted, and before it was rusted it was white, but I threw it in the bleach just to sort of weaken the fibres a little bit. I can now take this fabric and just tear it with my hands, and I get a really lovely worn vintage look. And I mean, this is broderie anglais. If I'd tried to tear a piece of this that hadn't been bleached, there would not be a chance that I could tear that with my hands. So again, I really like that technique for distressing the fabrics. So these pieces of fabric here are what has led to today's project. I had hung these pieces of fabric outside many years ago, at least 2 or 3 years ago. When I inspected them a little bit more closely, I could see that the clips that I had hung the fabric up with were very well and truly rusted and corroded, which I absolutely love. But it had left these gorgeous little sort of rusted stains on the fabric, which again, I really like that look. Now these are both synthetic fabrics, and they're now very weakened from being sat outside in the sun for so long. So they are again just falling apart, which is going to be great for using them as distressed fabrics. But I really like these rust marks, and I wanted to find a way to be able to replicate that look without having to pin up my fabric and forget that it's out there for a couple of years. So I started playing with some scraps that I had from my scrap box, and I've come up with this little rusted pin look. I had experimented with alcohol inks and a few other different inks, and I found that for me the best thing was the Distress Oxide re-inker. Now I didn't have any of just the normal Distress ink in Vintage Photo, which I would have really liked to have tried because I think it would work well with that as well. But I'm just going to show you how I did it using the Distress Oxide re-inker. If you don't have a re-inker but you do have the ink pad, you could just use acrylic block, dab your ink pad onto your acrylic block so you get some of the ink out of the pad and use it that way, because you only need a very, very small amount for this project. So I think what I'll use is a piece of this fabric that we distressed a little bit earlier. I'm just going to tear a piece off, and I'll use a piece of this rusted broderie anglais. And then I'll take a piece of this lace, and then just so that we can see what's happening with the faux rusting look, I've got a piece of, this is just cotton. It's a piece from the cotton rolls that we have in the shop, and this is cotton from India. And I'm just going to cut off a small piece. And rather than cut it, I'm just going to run it along the serrated blade of my scissors so it gets a more grungy sort of look. And before I pin it, I'm going to just bunch it up a little bit in my fingers. I've got a bulb pin here. So you can see I've been experimenting by my filthy fingers. I've got ink everywhere. So I like to go through my fabric completely once with my pin, and then I'll come back up. I'll scrunch up the top layer of fabric a bit more, and then I just go through that top layer or the top couple of layers a second time. It doesn't have to go all the way through. Now I've got a very, very small brush here, and I need to make sure that it's dry. So if you've used it for something else and it's been washed, just make sure that it's completely dry before you start. And I'm just going to take my Distress Oxide, and you literally just need the tiniest bit. So I'm just going to pop one drop here. I'll take my cluster, I'll pick up some of the ink just with the very tip of the brush, because I don't really want the ink to spread out on the fabric just yet. And I'm just going to place a couple of little dots of the ink around the bits where the pin goes into the fabric. So you can see it spreads very quickly, so you don't need very much. Then I pinch my pin between my fingers, and I take some water, but I don't want to use too much. I'm just going to sort of do a couple of little squirts and straight away pinch my fabric quite tightly between my fingers. So this will help the ink penetrate through the layers of fabric, but it also helps to stop the ink spreading and wicking out too much too quickly. Then when I open it up, it's got that sort of rusted look around the pin. Now this will lighten significantly once it's dry. So you can see from that one there, that one's quite a bit lighter. And if you get too much water on your fabric, it will wick out further and further to the point where sometimes you sort of lose the effect of the wicking because the fabric has gotten too wet and it's spread out too far. It will also vary from fabric to fabric. I found that the natural fibres like cotton seem to have a much better, more realistic look than the synthetic fibres, but you can still get some interesting results with the synthetic fibres as well. So this one's a synthetic fibre, and the rust effect has sort of taken more around where this little applique thing is here. So once they've dried, I think they look pretty realistic, and then you can of course just take your embellishment or whatever you'd like and then just use a little bit of glue to adhere it down onto your project. So you get something like that. So that's my little project for today. I hope you found that helpful and it gives you some ideas on how you might distress your new fabrics and make them look a bit more old. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'll see you again next time. Bye.